unlimited power. Hello, and thanks for joining me for this distillation of the first chapter from Zen Training Methods and Philosophy by Katsuki Sakata. As you can see, I have the book here. It's a fantastic book. I suggest you get it. And that's what we are going to talk about today. And if you haven't already, please view the previous entry in the playlist, the distillation of the editor's introduction of this book. Now, it's not absolutely necessary, but it may help you in getting a grasp on some of the concepts that Sakata talks here. So a little bit of what Sakata mentions in this orientation chapter is also said in a different way in the editor's introduction. So I think it may be useful. Also, please subscribe so you can be in the know about other videos we put out on the channel. So let's talk about the first chapter of the book, which is called Orientations. It is dense and it jumps from concept to concept quickly. I'd say it's less practical than the other chapters of the book, but the name is right. It orients you with respect to the book. This chapter summarizes the book. Now, Zen, while concerned with the mind, goes beyond contemplation about what the mind is and centers on the practitioner's own practice. In the realm of philosophy, Edmund Husserl proposed using a strategy called phenomenological reduction, which seems akin to Zen, but Husserl did not go into how to put his notion into practice. In Zen, we attempt to clamp down on our ego with our body and our mind, not just using our thoughts. Through this, we get to a state of pure existence. The typical initial practice in Zen is the sitting practice called Zazen. Now, there are other practices called Zazen, but this book refers to the sitting practice as Zazen, and that's what I will go with in this distillation of Sakata's text. Now, in Zazen, we achieve a state called Samadhi, where consciousness is halted, as well as awareness of time, space, and causality. This is a state of absolute stillness. It is also known as annihilation or nirvana, and it's a wakeful state. As mentioned in the editor's introduction, the mind tends to look at things as tools or equipment, in the words of Heidegger, simply as a matter of habit. Man looks at others and himself in the same way, rather than what they really are. So this obscures our view of the world. Zen tries to get rid of that mental model of reality, which can be overcome through Zazen. Through Zazen, we achieve Samadhi, and then we may attain a state called Kensho, where we see ourselves and the outside world as they are. We have recovered our pure consciousness in Samadhi and our pure existence in the world as well. Now, the state called Kensho goes by many names: enlightenment, satori, or realization, as this state which the Buddha achieved and then transmitted or taught to others how to achieve the same through his teachings. Most of the book is concerned with Zazen. It is done step by step, and reaching Kensho or even Samadhi will take learning technique and then practicing it. The initial practice would be to follow the breath by counting each exhale from 1 to 10 without having intervening thoughts arise. Now, this is easier said than done, and we need our body to help us accomplish this seemingly easy feat, notably from our focus on breathing and posture. An immobile posture is preferred to encourage stillness of the mind. If we reach a quite immobile state, we cease to be aware of our body's position, and our brain's cerebral cortex's activity decreases, which is needed to enter Samadhi. Regarding the breath, there is a relationship between our type of breathing and our state of mind. Someone angry has a different breath pattern than someone who falls in love at first glance. In Zazen, the mode of the breathing is performed using our abdominal muscles and the diaphragm. Basically, there's a tension between the contraction of the diaphragm and the contraction of the abdominal muscles. The diaphragm seeks to oppose the abdomen, which is trying to release all the air on the exhale. Tension then arises along with a slow exhale. When combined with the posture, only the abdominal muscles are working active and wakefulness and concentration is kept. The lower abdomen is called the tanden and is the seat of spiritual power. Later in the book, a physiological basis as to why wakefulness is spurred by the stimulation of the tanden is explored. Cicada poses that is control of the lower abdomen that allows us to control the mind, and posture and breathing are critical to entering Samdhi. After the mind loses its notion of the position of the body, which Cicada calls off sensation, the mind can reduce its activity such that the body and mind have fallen off and the cortex has very little activity. Yet something extraordinary arises in that the person is very awake, though the mind is very still. This is called pure existence. Cicada says that those who achieve this state and then return to the realm of conscious activity, being is transformed, and others who haven't experienced this being are veiled in darkness. Cicada's description seems akin to Plato's story of the men who lived all their life in a cave, where all they could see from the outside world are shadows projected on a wall. But they thought the shadows were the real objects rather than the objects themselves. Now, while each action that we take has to go through an ego, which consists of physical mental events or pressures that have an existence in the mind requires the ego to operate so long as it has a subjective operation, but the ego can change. So a narrow-minded ego can be squelched and replaced with one with a more expansive view. Done repeatedly, an egoless ego results, where you can see everything as it truly is, and you are not attached to things that you desire. It's not that you would no longer desire or grasp at things, but that desire is no longer in control of you. And now, a brief word from our sponsor. You made it halfway through, so now, admit it, you must love me by now. So please click that like button. Don't stop there, though. Subscribe. Now back to the show. Once someone sees true existence, they're taken out of the frying pan and put into the fire. The student is now faced with living as an individual, even though their worldview has fundamentally altered. The student needs additional training called Cultivation of the Holy Buddhahood, where the student learns how to avoid discrimination in a world of discrimination. What discrimination means in this context is not spelled out, but I found a definition of what discrimination means in this Buddhist context from the Lankavatara Sutra. And it goes like this. All that is seen in the world is devoid of effort and action, because all things in the world are like a dream or like an image miraculously projected. Now, this is not comprehended by the philosophers and the ignorant, but those who thus see things see them truthfully. Those who see things otherwise walk in discrimination, and as they depend on discrimination, they cling to dualism. The world as seen by discrimination is like seeing one's own image reflected in a mirror, or one's shadow, or the moon reflected in water, or an echo heard in the valley. People grasping their own shadows of discrimination become attached to this thing and that thing, and failing to abandon dualism, they go on forever discriminating and thus can never attain tranquility. By tranquility, it is meant oneness, and oneness gives birth to the highest sanity, which is gained by entering into the realm of noble wisdom that is realizable only within one's inmost consciousness. To me, that sounded like the parable of Plato's prisoners in the cave, as we discussed earlier. Or maybe you could view it in another context, like that the non-enlightened live in the matrix, or that we live in a simulation. Take your pick. But back to the text. Not only that, once someone achieves Kensho and returns to living regularly, the narrow-minded ego tends to re-emerge as it has deep roots. So training never ends, and the longer we train, the more we can be free of that kind of ego. So when narrow-minded or petty thoughts arise in the mind, we're to just acknowledge the petty thought and let it go. Don't follow it. Also, the term emptiness is defined in a variety of ways. One was a story that a deity wanted to see into Chan Master Tozen's mind, but wasn't able to. Now, Chan is the form of Zen in China. Zen came from China to Japan in the form of Chan Buddhism, and then it became Zen. So he tricked Tozen into making his petty ego emerge by surreptitiously throwing rice on the clean floor in the monastery. When Tozen saw this, he was miffed. And then the deity could see into Tozen's mind. I have to admit that that wasn't the cleanest explanation as to what emptiness was, but it seems that the parable is about keeping the ego in check. Let things go, lest there be a lack of equilibrium. Another explanation Cicada had for emptiness was that someone who attains emptiness in Buddhism is a Buddha. But at the same time, you are not a Buddha if you think you have attained Buddhahood. Such a notion has to be cast away for you to be empty. In psychological terms, emptiness entails not having internal mental pressure. This mental pressure is generated by thoughts where you may want to do something to relieve the pressure that's associated with such thoughts, like when you see a fluffy puppy and think, oh, that dog is cute. To relieve the pressure, you pet the dog or you say out loud, what a cute dog. The concept of mushin, or no ego, arises when there is a state of equilibrium in the mind, and arises when the ego, a structure made of internal pressures, like we just discussed, is fundamentally changed by Zen, where we train to be in equilibrium every single moment. And here's another story. Emperor Wu greeted Bodhidharma, the Chan master who brought Buddhism to China after a long journey. Now, a koan asks, why did Bodhidharma come to China? And the response is, no purpose. And no purpose here is meant to be emptiness. So we have another story about Bodhidharma. So the emperor told Bodhidharma about all the wonderful things he did for Buddhism, like building temples. And he wanted to know from the master if virtue would arise from those deeds. Bodhidharma said, no virtue. He went on, he said, the first principle from the Buddha was emptiness, not holiness. So you need to even set aside that notion of holiness for yourself. Ultimately, though, all this talk of empty mind has to be experienced rather than explained to you. And to do that, we need to do the training. The first part of Cicada's text will explain how to do the training. And then later on in the book, he gets more into the philosophy and psychology. So now I think you have a little taste of what the book is about. The editor's introduction contained a number of points made by Cicada in this chapter, but this chapter is, after all, a summary. And then what I gave you was really a summary of a summary. So this distillation that I did moved along at a really brisk pace. I think if someone did a summary of this distillation, it might just be shut up, sit down, and quiet your mind. But that wouldn't be too helpful. What Cicada has to say is very interesting, and I've gotten a lot out of it. Just doing the rereading and the distillation and writing it all out. This chapter did have a lot of theory, actually, but the next chapter on Zazen posture puts a lot of this into practice. So I think it will be a lot more concrete and practical, and I hope you'll join me for that. So thank you for joining me. Please take a look at the Distilled playlist for other videos regarding Zen training, methods, and philosophy. And please click the like button. And of course, please subscribe if you haven't already. I hope you have a fantastic day. No, wait, I maybe should just have an empty day. See you next time on Sloppy Zen. When Emperor Wu greeted Bodhidharma, okay. And here's another story. When Emperor Wu greeted Bodhidharma,